I never planned to become a farmer, let alone the kind of farmer who would change everything about how we think about agriculture. When my grandfather passed away and left me his 500-acre farm in central Iowa, I was working as an environmental consultant in Chicago, spending my days helping corporations minimize their ecological footprints while maximizing their profits. The irony wasn't lost on me when I drove down the gravel road to the old farmhouse for the first time as its owner. Grandpa's farm had been in our family for 4 generations, but it had been leased to neighboring farmers for the past decade. Walking through those fields, I could see the damage that industrial agriculture had inflicted on land that had once been pristine prairie. The soil was compacted and lifeless, the creek that ran through the property was cloudy with runoff, and I couldn't find a single earthworm in the first dozen holes I dug. The neighboring farmers who had been working the land approached me within days of my arrival, eager to continue their lease agreements. They spoke enthusiastically about their plans for the upcoming season. More corn, more soybeans, more of the same chemical-intensive monoculture that had been steadily degrading the soil for years. As they outlined their proposals, mentioning application rates for various pesticides and fertilizers like they were discussing the weather, I found myself thinking about my grandfather's stories. He used to tell me about farming before chemicals, when the soil was so rich and alive that crops practically grew themselves. He described fields that supported dozens of different species, where beneficial insects kept pest populations in check naturally, and where the land got more fertile with each passing year instead of less. Listening to these modern farmers discuss their chemical arsenal, I made a decision that would change everything. I announced my intentions at the monthly Farm Bureau meeting, standing before a room full of weathered faces that had seen every agricultural trend come and go. The silence that followed my declaration was deafening. I would farm the entire 500 acres naturally. No synthetic pesticides, no chemical fertilizers, no genetically modified seeds. I would rebuild the soil through cover cropping, rotational grazing, and integrated pest management using only natural methods. The reaction was swift and unanimous. Bill Henderson, who farmed 3,000 acres adjacent to my property, actually laughed out loud. "Son, your grandpa might have told you stories about the good old days, but he never had to feed the world like we do now. You'll be lucky to get half the yield we get, and whatever you do grow will be eaten by bugs before you can harvest it." Tom Schultz, whose family had farmed in the county for 6 generations, shook his head sadly. "I respect what you're trying to do, but you're about to learn some expensive lessons. Modern farming uses chemicals because they work. We've spent decades perfecting these systems, and there's a reason every successful farmer in this county uses them." The meeting devolved into a series of warnings and predictions of doom. They told me about the European corn borer infestations that would destroy my corn, the soybean aphids that would decimate my crops, and the weeds that would choke out anything I tried to grow. They painted a picture of inevitable failure, bankruptcy, and the eventual forced sale of my grandfather's land to more realistic farmers. But their certainty only strengthened my resolve. I had spent years studying ecological systems, and I knew that nature had been managing complex agricultural relationships for millions of years before humans invented the first pesticide. The question wasn't whether natural farming could work, it was whether I could learn fast enough to make it profitable. Block 3, the first season begins. Spring of 2023 brought my first real test as a natural farmer, and the challenges came faster than I had anticipated. While my neighbors were planting vast monocultures of genetically modified corn and soybeans, I was implementing a complex rotation system that would rebuild soil health while producing marketable crops. My 500 acres were divided into smaller plots featuring diverse plantings, heirloom corn varieties, heritage soybeans, cover crops, and even experimental plots of prairie grasses. The soil testing results from my first samples were sobering. Decades of chemical farming had left the earth depleted of organic matter, beneficial microorganisms, and essential nutrients. The pH was wrong, the structure was compromised, and the biological activity was practically non-existent. I spent weeks spreading composted manure, seeding cover crops, and inoculating the soil with beneficial bacteria and fungi that would begin the long process of restoration. My neighbors watched my unconventional methods with a mixture of amusement and pity. While they were applying their first rounds of herbicides and pesticides with military precision, I was releasing beneficial insects, planting flower strips to support pollinators, and installing habitat structures for birds and bats that would help control pest populations naturally. The differences in our approaches became stark as the season progressed. Their fields looked like biological deserts, neat rows of identical plants in soil that appeared clean and sterile. My fields looked chaotic by comparison, with diverse plantings, intentional weeds that served as habitat and soil builders, and a complexity that seemed almost wild. By midsummer, the skeptics seemed to be proven right. My corn was shorter than theirs, my soybeans were less uniform, and I was dealing with pest pressures that their chemicals had eliminated. But I was also seeing signs that gave me hope. Earthworms returning to my soil, beneficial insects establishing populations, and a gradual improvement in soil structure and water retention. Block 4. The learning curve. The first year taught me that natural farming wasn't just about avoiding chemicals. It was about understanding and working with complex ecological relationships that took time to establish. My yields were indeed lower than my neighbors, roughly 70% of what they achieved with their industrial methods. At the local grain elevator, I endured knowing looks and comments about hobby farming and trust fund agriculture. But I was learning lessons that couldn't be measured in bushels per acre. I discovered that my soil was becoming more resilient to weather extremes, holding moisture better during dry spells, and draining more efficiently during heavy rain. The beneficial insect populations I had been nurturing were beginning to establish stable colonies, creating a natural pest control system that would improve each year. My marketing strategy focused on the growing demand for organic and naturally grown products. I established relationships with local food cooperatives, farm-to-table restaurants, and health-conscious consumers who were willing to pay premium prices for food grown without chemicals. This direct marketing approach required more time and effort than simply dumping grain at the elevator, but it provided significantly higher returns per bushel. The financial picture was challenging but not hopeless. My input costs were much lower than my neighbors. No expensive pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, or GMO seed premiums. My labor costs were higher due to more complex management requirements, but I was building systems that would become more efficient over time. By late fall, I had documented everything I had learned in detailed journals, noting which techniques worked, which failed, and which needed modification. The soil tests showed marginal improvements in organic matter and biological activity. My banker was cautiously optimistic, my neighbors remained skeptical, and I was more determined than ever to prove that natural farming could compete with industrial agriculture. Block 5. Year 2 Improvements. The 2024 growing season began with noticeable improvements in my soil health and ecosystem development. The cover crops I had planted the previous fall had worked their magic over the winter, fixing nitrogen, breaking up compacted soil layers, and feeding the growing population of beneficial microorganisms. My spring soil tests showed significant improvements in organic matter content and biological activity. I expanded my integrated pest management system, introducing additional beneficial insects and establishing more diverse habitat areas throughout the farm. The bird houses and bat boxes I had installed were now occupied, and I was beginning to see measurable impacts on pest population. The flower strips and native plant areas were buzzing with pollinators and serving as reservoirs for beneficial insects that would spread throughout my crops. My neighbors continued their chemical programs with increasing intensity. Rising pest resistance had forced them to use stronger pesticides and higher application rates, while declining soil health required ever larger amounts of synthetic fertilizers to maintain yields. Their input costs were escalating rapidly, but their yields had plateaued, or even begun to decline in some cases. The contrast between our farming systems became more apparent as the season progressed. My fields were alive with birdsong, buzzing insects, and diverse plant communities. Their fields were silent except for the sound of machinery applying the latest chemical solutions to problems that seemed to multiply each year. My yields in year 2 reached 85% of conventional levels, but my profit margins were actually higher due to premium pricing and lower input costs. The soil was holding water better, requiring less irrigation during dry periods. The pest pressure was manageable through natural means, and I was beginning to see the kind of self-regulating ecosystem that my grandfather had described in his stories. Local food systems advocates were taking notice of my work, and I began receiving invitations to speak at sustainable agriculture conferences and farmer education events. The narrative was shifting from naive idealist to innovative pioneer, at least among those who understood the broader implications of what I was attempting. Block 6. the chemical crisis emerges. By midsummer 2024, disturbing reports began circulating through agricultural networks about a new strain of corn rootworm that seemed resistant to every available pesticide. The pest had first appeared in Nebraska, where entire fields of corn were being destroyed despite intensive chemical treatments. Extension agents were baffled by the rootworm's apparent immunity to pesticides that had been effective for decades. My neighbors initially dismissed the reports as isolated incidents in poorly managed fields. They had complete faith in their chemical arsenal and the advice of their crop consultants, who assured them that proper application timing and rates would prevent any serious problems. The seed companies and chemical manufacturers downplayed the severity of the situation, suggesting that minor adjustments to treatment protocols would solve any resistance issues. But the problem spread faster than anyone had anticipated. By late July, the resistant rootworm had been confirmed in Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. Fields that had received multiple pesticide applications were being devastated, with corn plants wilting and dying as the larvae destroyed root systems that couldn't regenerate quickly enough to sustain the plants. I watched my neighbors' confidence turn to concern, then to panic, as their crops began showing signs of infestation, despite following all recommended treatment protocols. The chemical companies rushed new products to market, promising solutions that failed as quickly as they were applied. The rootworm seemed to adapt to new pesticides almost immediately, as if decades of chemical warfare had created a nearly invincible adversary. My own fields remained largely unaffected. The diverse ecosystem I had been building was proving remarkably resilient to the crisis that was devastating industrial agriculture throughout the Midwest. The beneficial insects, birds, and other natural predators I had been nurturing were keeping pest populations in check through biological controls that couldn't be overcome by simple genetic mutations. As reports of crop failures mounted across the region, I began to understand that we were witnessing something unprecedented in modern agriculture. The potential collapse of the chemical-dependent farming system that had dominated American agriculture for generations. Block 7. The Ecosystem Advantage. While my neighbors battled an increasingly hopeless war against the super-resistant rootworm, my farm was demonstrating the power of ecological balance. The diverse habitat I had created supported a complex web of beneficial organisms that worked together to control pest populations naturally. Ground beetles, parasitic wasps, spiders, and other predators maintained pest populations at manageable levels without any need for chemical intervention. The contrast became stark during the August heat wave that stressed crops throughout the region. My neighbor's corn, growing in depleted soil with compromised root systems damaged by the rootworm, began showing severe signs of drought stress despite normal rainfall. Their plants had shallow, damaged root systems that couldn't access water stored deeper in the soil profile. My corn, growing in soil that had been rebuilt with organic matter and beneficial microorganisms, showed remarkable resilience to the heat stress. The living soil held moisture more effectively, and the plants had developed deeper, healthier root systems that could access water and nutrients even under difficult conditions. The diverse plantings also created beneficial microclimates that moderated temperature extremes and reduced moisture loss. I began documenting the differences between our farms with photographs and yield measurements that told a compelling story. While my neighbors were dealing with plant mortality rates of 30–40% in their most affected fields, my crops were thriving. The beneficial insects I had been nurturing for 2 years were providing pest control services that no amount of money could buy in the current crisis. Extension agents and agricultural researchers began visiting my farm to study the biological control methods that were succeeding where chemicals had failed. They were amazed by the diversity of beneficial species and the effectiveness of the natural pest management system I had developed. Some admitted privately that they were witnessing the future of agriculture, even as their official recommendations still focused on chemical solutions. The economic implications were becoming clear as well. While my neighbors faced potential crop losses that could bankrupt their operations, my farm was on track for its best year yet, both in terms of yield and profitability. Block 8. The collapse accelerates. By late August, the magnitude of the agricultural crisis became impossible to ignore. The resistant rootworm had spread to every major corn-producing state, and reports of crop failures were creating panic in commodity markets. Corn futures skyrocketed as traders realized that the American corn crop, the foundation of the global food system, was facing unprecedented losses. My neighbors, who had once mocked my natural farming methods, were now asking desperate questions about how they might transition to biological pest control methods. But the infrastructure for natural farming couldn't be built overnight. The beneficial insect populations, soil health, and ecosystem relationships that protected my crops had taken years to establish and couldn't be replicated with quick fixes. The chemical companies, facing potential lawsuits and regulatory action, began developing increasingly toxic pesticides in an attempt to overcome the rootworm's resistance. But each new chemical seemed to fail faster than the last, and the environmental damage from these desperate measures was becoming severe. Reports of bee kills, bird deaths, and contaminated water supplies multiplied as farmers applied ever more dangerous chemicals in futile attempts to save their crops. My farm became a refuge for wildlife that was being poisoned elsewhere. Birds, beneficial insects, and even small mammals began appearing in unusual numbers as they fled the chemical warfare being waged on neighboring properties. The biodiversity I had been working to establish was now being supplemented by refugee species that had nowhere else to go. Agricultural economists began calculating the potential economic impact of the crisis. With corn yields down 40–60% across the Midwest, the effects would ripple through every sector of the food system. Livestock feed costs would skyrocket, food prices would increase dramatically, and rural communities dependent on agriculture would face economic devastation. But on my farm, the corn stood tall and healthy, protected by an army of beneficial organisms that had been decades in the making, but only 2 years in the restoration. Block 9. Media attention and vindication. The agricultural crisis made national news when corn futures reached record highs, and food companies began warning of potential shortages and price increases. News crews descended on the Midwest to document the crop failures, and inevitably, they discovered my farm, an island of green abundance in a sea of withering, chemical-burned fields. The visual contrast was striking enough to make compelling television. Drone footage showed my healthy, diverse crops thriving next to my neighbors' devastated monocultures. The story that emerged was one of vindication for sustainable agriculture methods that had been dismissed as impractical idealism just months earlier. Agricultural reporters who interviewed me were amazed by the resilience of my natural farming system. They documented the beneficial insect populations, the soil health improvements, and the economic advantages of farming without dependence on increasingly expensive and ineffective chemicals. The story of my success spread through social media and farming communities worldwide as an example of what was possible when ecological principles guided agricultural practices. But the attention also brought pressure from desperate neighbors who wanted immediate solutions to problems that had been decades in the I tried to explain that transitioning to natural farming was a long-term process that required patience, learning, and significant changes in mindset. The ecological relationships that protected my crops couldn't be purchased or applied like chemicals. They had to be cultivated over time. Some of my neighbors accused me of profiting from their misfortune, as if my success somehow caused their failures. They couldn't accept that their chemical-dependent system had inherent vulnerabilities that made collapse inevitable. The idea that their modern methods were actually less advanced than my primitive approach challenged fundamental assumptions about progress and technology. I tried to help where I could, sharing knowledge about biological pest control and soil restoration. But I also had to protect the ecosystem I had spent years building from well-meaning but potentially destructive intervention attempts by farmers who still thought in terms of quick chemical fixes. Block 10. The economic reckoning. As the 2024 harvest season arrived, the full economic impact of the agricultural crisis became apparent. My neighbors, who had invested heavily in chemical inputs that failed to protect their crops, were facing devastating losses. Many were looking at bankruptcy, forced land sales, and the end of multi-generational farming operations that had survived the Great Depression, droughts, and previous agricultural crises. My own harvest told a different story. Despite lower overall yields compared to what conventional farming had achieved in good years, my crops were healthy, marketable, and commanded premium prices in a market desperate for quality grain. The organic and naturally grown premiums I had been receiving for 2 years now looked like genius-level market positioning as conventional grain supplies dwindled. The financial calculations were remarkable. While my neighbors had spent thousands of dollars per acre on pesticides that failed to work, my input costs remained minimal. Their debt loads from purchasing expensive chemicals and equipment were crushing their operations just when they needed capital most to survive the crisis. My debt-free operation with low input costs was generating profits even in the midst of an industry collapse. Local banks that had been skeptical of my farming methods were now eager to finance expansion. They could see that natural farming wasn't just environmentally responsible. It was financially resilient in ways that chemical-dependent agriculture was not. The diversified income streams from direct marketing, agritourism, and premium grain sales provided multiple revenue sources that buffered against market volatility. Insurance companies were taking notice as well. My natural farming methods had demonstrated lower risk profiles than conventional operations, leading to discussions about premium discounts for farmers who could prove ecological resilience. The industry was beginning to recognize that biodiversity and soil health weren't just environmental benefits. They were risk management strategies. I began receiving calls from agricultural investors and land buyers who were interested in financing natural farming operations or purchasing land specifically for ecological restoration. The crisis had revealed that chemical agriculture was not only environmentally unsustainable, but also economically unstable. Block 11. Teaching the next generation. The agricultural crisis created an unexpected demand for education about natural farming methods. Universities, extension services, and farmer organizations that had previously dismissed sustainable agriculture as a niche market suddenly needed experts who could teach biological pest control, soil restoration, and ecological farming systems. I found myself traveling throughout the Midwest, conducting workshops and seminars for farmers who were desperate to transition away from chemical dependence. The audiences were often skeptical initially, having been trained to think of chemicals as essential tools for modern agriculture. But the failure of those same chemicals had created an openness to alternatives that hadn't existed before the crisis. Teaching natural farming to chemically trained farmers required addressing fundamental philosophical differences about how agriculture works. They had been taught to think of farming as warfare against nature, controlling pests, eliminating weeds, and forcing productivity through external inputs. Natural farming required thinking of agriculture as partnership with nature, supporting beneficial organisms, building soil health, and creating conditions where crops could thrive naturally. The learning curve was steep for farmers who had relied on simple chemical solutions for complex ecological problems. Understanding soil biology, beneficial insect life cycles, and plant-pest-predator relationships required knowledge that agricultural schools had largely abandoned in favor of chemistry and engineering approaches. But the crisis had created powerful motivation for learning. Farmers who had previously dismissed soil health as hippie nonsense were now eager to understand how to rebuild the biological systems that could protect their crops naturally. They were discovering that their grandfathers' farming methods weren't primitive. They were sophisticated ecological management systems that industrial agriculture had abandoned in favor of temporary chemical fixes. I worked with agricultural extension agents to develop curriculum and training programs that could help farmers transition to natural methods. The demand was overwhelming, and I realized that the crisis had created an opportunity to fundamentally reshape American agriculture in ways that would benefit both farmers and the environment for generations to come. Block 12. The community transformation. The agricultural crisis forced our farming community to confront the reality that chemical-dependent agriculture was not just environmentally destructive, but economically unsustainable. As more farmers faced bankruptcy and land foreclosure, the social fabric of rural communities began to fray. But the crisis also created opportunities for innovation and cooperation that hadn't existed when chemical agriculture was profitable. I began working with bankrupt farmers to help them transition their land to natural farming method. Instead of selling to corporate agriculture, some chose to lease their land to me and other natural farmers who could restore soil health while generating income that would eventually allow them to farm again. This arrangement created a pathway for farmers to recover from the crisis while learning sustainable methods. The local food system that I had been building for 2 years suddenly became essential infrastructure. As industrial agriculture failed and food prices skyrocketed, consumers were eager to buy directly from local farmers who could guarantee chemical-free production. Farmers markets, CSA programs, and farm-to-table restaurants became not just lifestyle choices, but economic necessities. Our county extension office, which had previously focused on promoting chemical agriculture, began hosting workshops on soil biology, integrated pest management, and organic certification. The same agents who had once dismissed my methods were now studying them as models for agricultural recovery and resilience. The transformation extended beyond farming to rural economic development. The diverse, labor-intensive nature of natural farming created employment opportunities that industrial agriculture had eliminated. Young people who had left for urban careers began returning to work on farms that offered meaningful work in sustainable food production. Even the local grain elevator, which had initially been skeptical of my organic premiums, began marketing itself as a source for naturally grown grain. They installed separate storage and handling systems to maintain organic certification, and began actively recruiting natural farmers to supply the growing demand for chemical-free commodities. The community that had once mocked my farming methods was now embracing them as the foundation for economic recovery and long-term sustainability. Block 13. The New Agricultural Revolution. 3 years after I first announced my intention to farm naturally, the agricultural landscape had been fundamentally transformed. The chemical crisis that had devastated conventional farming had accelerated a transition to sustainable methods that might have taken decades under normal circumstances. My farm had become a demonstration site for agricultural researchers, policymakers, and farmers from around the world who wanted to understand how natural systems could replace chemical inputs. The economic benefits of natural farming were now undeniable. My operation was profitable, resilient, and environmentally regenerative. The soil health improvements had resulted in increased yields that were approaching conventional levels while maintaining premium prices and low input costs. The risk profile was lower, the debt load was minimal, and the long-term sustainability was proven. But the victory felt bittersweet when I considered the cost. Many of my neighbors had lost farms that had been in their families for generations. The transition to natural farming, while ultimately successful, had required painful adjustments and learning curves that some couldn't navigate quickly enough to save their operation. The agricultural industry as a whole was being forced to confront the reality that chemical agriculture had been living on borrowed time. Pest resistance, soil degradation, and environmental damage had made the industrial model unsustainable, even before the rootworm crisis accelerated its collapse. Natural farming wasn't just an alternative. It was becoming the only viable option for long-term agricultural success. Policymakers were beginning to understand that agricultural subsidies needed to support ecological restoration rather than chemical consumption. Insurance programs were being redesigned to reward biodiversity and soil health. Agricultural research was shifting focus from developing new pesticides to understanding biological systems. As I walked through my fields at harvest time, watching beneficial insects go about their work of maintaining ecological balance, I thought about my grandfather's stories. He had been right about the soil being alive, about farming being partnership with nature rather than conquest of it. The crisis that had devastated chemical agriculture had revealed that the oldest farming methods were actually the most advanced, and that the future of agriculture lay in rediscovering principles that had been forgotten in the rush to embrace industrial solutions. The land that had been mocked as a naive experiment had become a beacon of hope for a new agricultural revolution, one based on working with nature rather than against it, and one that could feed the world while healing the earth.